Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news, expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Well, summer is in full swing, which means that crowds from the world over are heading on vacation, and many of them are descending in huge numbers into one of the most famous cities there is, Venice, Italy. Earlier this spring, the 60th edition of the Venice Biennale opened, curated by the highly esteemed Brazilian curator Adriano Pedrosa. His exhibition, Foreigners Everywhere, is a major feat and a big talking point of the year. It features more than 330 artists, many of whom are participating in the Biennale for the first time. And many of the works are historical positions as well, by artists who were overlooked in their own time. The reviews are in and well worth reading. My colleague Ben Davis has a great 3-part review of the show that you can read on ArtNet that we will include in the show notes as well. But before the exhibition opened, I had chatted with Pedrosa himself about his intentions and aims with Foreigners Everywhere. He offered tips on how to walk through the exhibition, key background on the show's concepts, and thoughts on how this show is repaying a historical debt. It is well worth a listen, and so we are resharing it here. Foreigners Everywhere is on view until November 24th, 2024.
I thought it was interesting not only to develop the núcleo contemporâneo, as I call it, which is focused in these 4 subjects, the foreigner, the indigenous, the queer, and the outsider, but also a núcleo histórico looking at modernisms in the global south.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by ArtNet News. Next week, the art world will descend into the Venetian lagoon for the Venice Biennale, the most highly anticipated art event of this year. The Brazilian curator Adriano Pedrosa is at the helm of the prestigious group exhibition, which is now in its 60th edition, and his show includes more than 300 artists and collectives presented in the historic Arsenale and the Central Pavilion in the Giardini. Many of these artists, who are largely based or from the global south, are on view for the first time in these revered spaces. There are multiple ways to look at the show and its title, Foreigners Everywhere, which is inspired by a famous work of the same name by artist collective Clairefontaine. It is both an acknowledgement of the artistic positions of exile, of the immigrant, or of the outsider, but also importantly, it asks of the audience to think about who exactly is a foreigner and who is not. The curator argues that deep down, we are all foreigners. And this exhibition, which Pedrosa described to me as a provocation, also comes as the world is facing a multitude of emergencies around the very concepts of exile and belonging. Just as everything was coming together over the last weeks ahead of the April vernissage, I had the pleasure of speaking with Pedrosa about what visitors can expect from Foreigners Everywhere and about his vision for the show. He shared his views on how one should navigate an exhibition of this scale, and we discussed his background as a curator in Sao Paulo, which included organizing pioneering exhibitions of marginalized perspectives and histories during Jair Bolsonaro's populist reign in Brazil. We also spoke about his understanding of what it means to be a foreigner from both a political and artistic perspective. Hi, Adriano. Thank you so much for joining me today. I imagine you're in the midst of a lot of meetings and a lot of running around. Where am I finding you right now?
I am in Venice. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to your audience. We are basically beginning to install works in the space, as well as there's been a few artists, 3 artists that are working on very large-scale works, and they have been here for a couple of weeks already.
I'm heading to Venice for the Vernissage week, and I'm very much looking forward to your exhibition. It's of a huge scale and with so many artists that I've never had the chance to see their work in person before. So I'm really excited to dive into this today. So you're very close now to the opening, and it's set to be groundbreaking in so many ways. This is the first biennial to be organized by a curator who openly identifies as queer, the first to be helmed by a curator from Latin America, and the first to be led by someone who's also based full-time in the global south. And then as well, this is also the largest representation of queer and indigenous art in the Venice Biennial's history, I believe. So these are major milestones. And I imagine they bring with them a huge sense of pride and also inevitably an amount of pressure to get it right, I suppose. How do you navigate the latter?
Right. I would say interesting that you mention it as a huge sense of pride. I always saw it as a huge responsibility because of all that, because of being from Latin America, from the first curator actually living and based in the Global South. After, of course, the first curator from the Global South indeed is the late, great Auquien Weather, who curated the exhibition in 2015, although he was based in Germany at the time, working in Munich. So because of that, I approached the task with thinking really that this is almost a mission, and I had enormous responsibilities to try to bring artists from this part of the world, not just Latin America, but also Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia, as well as indigenous artists, as well as queer artists, as well as outsider artists. I did think about the Biennale really quite strategically because the Biennale is arguably the most important biennial, perhaps the most important platform of contemporary art, certainly the one that draws more visibility to the works and to the artists. Often having participated in a Biennale is very important information in the artist's exhibition history or in the exhibition history of an artwork itself, right? So I do understand that these days, it's much easier than it was for most of the 20th century, let's say, for an artist from the Global South to participate in a large-scale international exhibition. You can't organize a biennial or a large-scale global art show without artists, say, from Mexico or Nigeria or India or Turkey or Brazil or Argentina or South Africa, for that matter. These artists are always present in these exhibitions. But that doesn't happen so much with artists that were working in the 20th century. And that's why I thought it was interesting not only to develop the núcleo contemporáneo, as I call it, which is focused in these four subjects, the foreigner, the indigenous, the queer, and the outsider, but also a núcleo histórico looking at modernisms in the Global South, artists working in the 20th century in the Global South. In a way, the vast majority of these artists in the núcleo histórico are participating for the first time. Many of these artists are canonical figures in Egypt or South Africa or Nigeria or Pakistan or Ecuador or Colombia, but they are not well known internationally and they didn't have the chance to participate in the Biennale. So in a way, it's almost as if the Biennale is paying a debt towards these artists, right? And also I should say that looking at the 20th century with a sort of decolonizing approach, if you like, I think we can say that much of the contemporary art panorama has been decolonized in a sense, because now we have artists from different parts of the world. Of course, one can always decolonize further, right? But that doesn't happen so much with the 20th century. And that's why I see it as quite a contemporary position to organize an exhibition devoted to 20th century artists like this one. At least this is how I see it, my approach. It is these artists, they're not well known internationally. So their work, I believe, do have kind of contemporary relevance in that sense. I often say that it's a very exciting time in art history because many of us in many different parts of the world are discovering artists within the 20th century, some of them canonical figures in their own contexts, that were really not well known internationally, right? That's what it makes it so exciting, and I feel also so contemporary. I realize this was a very long answer. Sorry about that.
No, I think it was a fantastic kind of introduction to the basic foundation of what you're trying to do. And I think that this term of repaying a debt is such a compelling one. Maybe we can now talk a little bit more about the structure of the show. These thematic clusters, as you say, these nuclei, there's going to be a contemporary and historic ones throughout the exhibition, which is, between the Arsenali and the Giardini. I was interested to ask you about your curatorial strategy in a longer sense, because, those who know your work will recognize that you've done a similar kind of approach with your work at the MASP in Sao Paulo with this ongoing series of exhibitions called Histories. Can you explain what these shows are? I understand they were very revolutionary and progressive, and what kind of overlapping approaches there are that we can look forward to in Venice.
I would say, for example, at MASP, Museu de Arte de São Paulo sur Chateaubriand, where I'm artistic director, we have been organizing our exhibition program since 2017. It's always dedicated to a full set of histories. So we've done histories of sexuality, feminist histories, Afro-Atlantic histories. We've just done last year indigenous histories, and this year we have a full year devoted to queer history. So as you see, some of these themes have come up and are coming up in our own program. Most notably, indigenous histories last year. We did a full year devoted to indigenous houses in the program and did a large-scale group exhibition titled Indigenous Histories. And again, this year, which we're just starting, we just opened an exhibition devoted to Grand Fury. And the full year will be devoted to that. But I would say Afro-Atlantic Histories was a very special year for us. It's an exhibition that, in fact, traveled through Washington, Los Angeles, Dallas, and Houston, and just closed in Dallas last month. And there, for example, we looked at relationships between Africa and the Americas through the Atlantic. And there were quite a number of sometimes exactly the same work. We have some exact same works that are participating now in the Núcleo Histórico. We have, for example, Barrington Watson, a Jamaican artist. We have Gerard Sekoto, a South African modernist. We have Ibrahim El Salahi, another African modernist, and Dumili Feni and Wilfredo Lam, just to mention a few of these artists that were back in Afro-Atlantic histories in the section devoted to Afro-Atlantic modernisms, which reappear again in the Biennale, in the Núcleo Histórico of the Biennale. But I should say that this Núcleo Histórico also, that harks back to another project that I worked in 1998 in the São Paulo Biennial. I was a very young curator, invited to work with Paulo Heckenhoff, who was a very important curator in Brazil, in what is considered one of the most iconic editions of the São Paulo Biennial, devoted to anthropophagia. And that exhibition also had a núcleo histórico. In Portuguese, it's written with H-I-S, and in Italian with S-T-O. So it does hark back to that historical segment of the São Paulo Biennial in 1998, which was organized around anthropophagia, which is an important sort of concept within Brazilian modernism, that I'm again using it as a possible tool to look at modernisms in the Global South, no? And that appears again in particularly the section devoted to portraits and representations of the human figure.
It's interesting because, of course, biennials, typically, and perhaps incorrectly, as I think you're probably going to prove, become this referendum on the idea of the ultra-contemporary and the now. But the now leaves out so many people who were left out before. So what do you hope to achieve by working with a different sense of time? Can you explain a little bit how delineating might open up more possibilities for understanding these avenues of history?
Indeed, yes. I think a biennial is mostly devoted to contemporary art, but I'm coming from a history in São Paulo where there were often historical segments and historical positions in the exhibition itself. I also feel that, as I said, these histories are quite relevant and are being discovered right now, are very exciting. What I'm trying to do is really sort of almost a speculative curatorial exercise. It hasn't really been done. It's a draft, it's an essay, it's a provocation. It's definitely not a definitive sort of encyclopedic presentation of such a vast topic, such as modernism in the Global South. I do feel that Venice does give us this opportunity to reinvent something and propose something quite ambitious because of the enormous energy that it gathers. Of course, I say that I would have needed a 5-year research period with a group of 10 advisors to put together something in this broad topic for an exhibition in a museum. But the Biennale does offer us this very exciting opportunity. There's a lot of support from different colleagues who are, happy to advise, but also different funding because it's really quite expensive to put together something like that. And there's exceptional kind of unique visibility. And this is what these artists really need, right? I think everyone, at least Cecilia Alemani, actually, I should say there are some connections between what she was trying to do and what I trying to do. She had historical positions as well. Completely different approach, wonderful approach, very relevant approach. But she had contemporary positions as well. She had her capsules, right? If you recall, I am working with this idea of the nucleo in a quite different manner. But we do have this interest in certain rewriting of art history. I don't think I'm rewriting art history, but I'm proposing to question more established narratives of art history. And hopefully, it's not just me. It's not just this exhibition. This exhibition is a provocation, but other people and other institutions and other projects or other scholars might want to sort of unfold this and take it elsewhere. So I think this is what's very exciting and what's very contemporary about the proposal as well. But I also should say, going back to the general kind of framework of foreigners everywhere, that modernism itself, which, becomes kind of a problematic notion at some point, but let's use it as an operative tool somehow. Modernism does travel much beyond Europe and much beyond the US, right? And artists also travel quite a lot through modernism. Artists travel to Rome or to Paris or to London, Berlin, Madrid, Amsterdam, New York during the 20th century. It's interesting actually to see how artists like Amrita Shergill from India or Tarsila do Amaral from Brazil, when they go to Paris in the 20s, they in fact in Paris, looking at modernism, they rediscover their own kind of indigenous and native references. It's as if going to Paris makes them aware of the importance or of their own indigenous national references. That's quite interesting. And they bring that to their own work. And that's where anthropophagia comes in. Anthropophagia is a concept that comes up in 1928 in the Manifesto Antropófago, written by Oswaldo de Andrade, Brazilian modernist intellectual. He proposes in a very poetic manner a tool for intellectuals and artists working in the global south, in the third world, at the margins of Europe. And of course, the global south expression was not current at the time. How these intellectuals at the margins of Europe could relate to the European tradition, to the European canon. His proposal is that they would appropriate, cannibalize, and devour European references and appropriating that, digesting it, and producing something of their own, often bringing in native, indigenous, local, personal references within that. And I think that's an interesting tool to look at. Not all, it's one possible tool, of course, among many, but it's an interesting tool to look at these productions in the 20th century in the global south.
Yeah, this remapping of these currents. We assume that we knew which directions they were flowing, but I think that this sounds like you're going to show they were really multi-directional in so many ways. So there's 330 artists and collectives in the exhibition. And I'm curious, how did you research and edit for an exhibition of this size? Cecilia Alemani had a very unique challenge, of course, doing that during the pandemic. I imagine you were able to do a lot more mileage and travel to some of these places that you spoke of just now.
Yes, yeah. The global south is much bigger than the global north, indeed. So I have traveled a lot during my life. I don't think you can face a project like this and think that you will be visiting all these places for the first time. I visited a few places for the first time: Luanda and Harare and Nairobi, Santo Domingo, Guatemala. some very specific places that I had not been. But other than that, mostly I was returning to Beirut or to Istanbul or to Hong Kong or to Manila, to Jakarta, to La Paz, to Santiago, Buenos Aires, Mexico, other parts of the world. I think it's much easier to return, even if you have just a couple of days, at least you have that history of being in that place. And for example, if I go a couple of days to South Africa, I already have the memory and a little bit of knowledge of when I was there a couple of times before. So it becomes easier for me to complement this with bringing in new research. The exhibition does have quite a lot of artists. The checklist is a little bit deceiving, I should say, because we have a larger number of artists in the núcleo histórico than in the núcleo contemporâneo. But what happens is that in the núcleo histórico, each artist is present with one single work only in these three sections. Two sections in the Giardini, in the central pavilion, in the section devoted to abstractions and the section devoted to portraits and representations of the human figure. And also in the Corderie of the Arsenali, in the section devoted to what I'm calling Italians everywhere, right? So it seems that the larger part of the exhibition are these artists, but not so much, in fact. So the contemporary nucleus, which comprises around 110 artists, plus some 40 artists in the Film and Video Disobedience Archive, they have a lot more space. The works are much larger, or I have the number of works larger. So it's a much larger presence. The Núcleo Contemporâneo in general, although much smaller number of artists, has a much bigger presence in the exhibition. That's why I say when you look at the list of artists, it's a bit deceiving in that sense, because it doesn't correspond to the reality of the exhibition, the presence of the works in the space. I also should say that it was never my objective to have more artists. I would have loved to have fewer artists in the list, but I just felt that these made sense. I also should say that although in the last edition there were fewer artists, there were many more works. The checklist was actually much larger in the previous edition than it is in this one. So far as we're planning, I think the density of the exhibition in the space in terms of volume won't be as much as it was in the previous edition. This is my feeling, right? Does that make sense? So it's a little bit deceiving when you see, 300 artists. It's going to be such a crowded exhibition and so many works. I mean, the núcleo histórico rooms are rather dense, are rather crowded, but it's 3 rooms. It's like 2 rooms and 1 double room. The portraits is a double room, 1 room next to each other, right?
It's increasingly important to challenge, as you've just explained what you're doing, the parameters and the formats and also the structural limitations of a biennial. I'm curious if there is a recent biennial, or it could be even, longer into the past, that was really foundational for you in a way that changed your view of what a biennial can and should do. Could be an exhibition as well.
Well, I think definitely the 1998 São Paulo Biennial. I think that was quite important for me. It's my first major kind of curatorial project, but also a very strong historical position, and became quite important within the history of 20th century kind of exhibitions. I think this is a very important exhibition for me. In terms of these historical positions, I would say that Ocui and Weser's post-war exhibition, it's called Post-War Art Between the Atlantic and the Pacific, in 2017 at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. That was a very important exhibition. The period he was looking at was 1945, 1965, but he was also proposing a much wider kind of global, diverse outlook in terms of art history. So I thought that was quite fascinating. Again, his exhibition as well, the short century that he did in 2001, I believe, that went to PS1, also devoted to African arts since the post-war period up until late 20th century. That exhibition I didn't see. I have the catalog, which I've studied so much over the years. And there are many artists in both exhibitions that are also in the Biennale. Those are very important references for me, these two exhibitions by Ocui.
It's hard to overstate the influence and the impact that he's had on the art world. An incredible curator and voice. So turning to the title, Foreigners Everywhere, as you've explained, there's multiple ways to kind of access it, which I think it makes such a compelling argument. And one aspect is that it's a clever provocation. The foreigner is obviously a loaded term within the context of an exhibition whose longer history has been, celebrating nation states, of course. And obviously you're playing with this idea of the stranger. I'm curious if you could answer how you're thinking about this title and this show actually within the context of Italy specifically. And Italy right now, the current prime minister's election win was credited in part with her kind of anti-immigration policies and generally a nationalist agenda. So in what ways are you commenting or trying to provoke a discussion there?
Well, I think an exhibition is always a provocation. I think definitely the exhibition is celebrating migration and celebrating the foreigner as well as the queer and the indigenous and the outsider and the self-taught or the artista popular. So I think this is something that it's not really just up to me. I mean, I'm someone that's inviting people and selecting artists and selecting artworks, but I hope that the exhibition will do that much more than myself, really. I think the exhibition and the artworks, it's a really kind of polyphonic project, right? Because if you have 330 artists, you have 330 voices, or even more, because sometimes you have artists with multiple works that speak through different voices as well, though, or different accents, if you were. So definitely, yeah, I think this is part of the provocation, no?
Can you elaborate a little bit about your view on the name and how you came up with it as well? I understand that you'd had it in your mind for many years, this title.
Claire Fontaine had it in their mind for a long time.
When they're in the show, right?
Yes, of course. They're in the show and they collaborated quite a lot in the design aspect, in the merchandise, everything. We do a lot of back and forth and collaboration. And I've been working with them for more than, I think around 15 years already. They are a couple, an Italian and an Irishman living in Palermo these days. They were founded in Paris. And they, in turn, appropriated the name of a collective that was fighting racism and xenophobia in Torino in the beginning of the 2000s. And they've been doing this series of neon sculptures since 2004. What the sculptures are basically is the expression foreigners everywhere, stranieri ovunque, in many different languages. There are over 50 different languages. Individual works, individual sculptures, neon sculptures, about maybe 2 meters wide. And they will be presented in a very sort of large-scale installation at the Gachandre space here in the Arsenale in Venice. The exhibition has these two main venues, the Corderie in the Arsenale and the Central Pavilion. And the first room where you have the wall text, the introductory text, we will also have one neon in English in one spot and one neon in Italian in another spot. So the expression itself, yes, I've had it in my mind for a long time. More importantly, going back to another exhibition that I was involved in the past, in 2009, I was invited to curate an exhibition at the Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo, the MAM, the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo. And they organize a biennial devoted to Brazilian contemporary art. And it's called Panorama da Arte Brasileira. and I was invited to organize the 2009 edition. And I thought it was interesting to do something, more provocative and speculative as often. And my proposition was that Brazilian contemporary art was not solely made by Brazilians. It could be art made by foreigners that had Brazilian references or content somehow. So my panorama da arte brasileira only included foreign artists, as if you're doing a Whitney Biennial only with like foreigners, non-US artists. That was the idea. Of course, it was a very polemic project. I was accused of like not including the Brazilians. In that project, I also had a small residency with my maybe 6 or 7 artists that came. Claire Fontaine were invited. This is the first time I worked with them in 2009. And they came and spent time in São Paulo for the first time. And what they did was 2 neon sculptures. One, Foreigners Everywhere in Portuguese. And the second sculpture was made in Old Tupi language. Old Tupi is an extinct language, indigenous Brazilian language. And the title in Old Tupi became the subtitle of the panorama. The panorama always has like a subtitle. So the subtitle was Mamoyuguara Opa Mamo Pupe, which is Foreigners Everywhere in Old Tupi. So in fact, I have done an exhibition, a very different exhibition. It was completely different exhibition, completely different scale, approach, but with the same title, but in a different language. So this is 2009. A couple years later, I believe it was 2011, one of the very few times that I visited the Venice Biennale, not at the opening. So I was looking around the Biennale, and I was thinking how difficult it must be to come up with a framework and a title that has some specificity, that is somehow generous, but is also palpable. This is my humble opinion, but I find that most biennials, they usually have either quite poetic names or cryptic titles. They're not very didactic, or they're not very generous, or they don't provide a lot of specificity. Right. So it's these wonderfully kind of poetic titles that everything could fit under that. I remember talking once to a curator that had worked in the Biennale. He was describing his title, and I said, but is there any artist that would not fit in your title and framework? And he said, no. Any artist would fit. It's just a way of framing it. I said, okay. So I thought, I was trying to do something different. I thought, it'd be more interesting to come up with something that has some complexities, the poetic dimension, a political dimension, but also could be generous and give hints to the people, the audience, of what they would encounter. And that's how I came up with say, okay, Foreigners Everywhere would be wonderful because it's coming from Italy, right? The Stranieri Ovunque. But I never really thought I would do the Biennale back then. Visiting the Biennale on your own, when you're not at the opening, you have a lot of free time to think about the exhibition and the works. So I was visiting, and I, almost as a curatorial exercise, came up with that expression. So I've had it with me for a long time, and it's always been a joke sometimes with a couple of friends. It's, if you do the Biennale, I say, I have a concept already. I have it, or for Italy or for elsewhere. But Italy, I think it's even more site-specific because of the Torino reference, because of the Mediterranean, because of North Africa, because of Clairefontaine. So it's always been like a possible title. But when I got the call from the president, Roberto Cicuto, back in October 21, he was starting to interview different people. He then spoke to me and I said, okay, Stranieri Ovunque, let's begin to think about that. And then I started to unfold it and started to complexify it. Because at first I thought, it could be just an exhibition just with foreigners. And then I thought, okay, I think it's interesting to maybe try to unfold this in different ways, because just foreigners for like an exhibition as large as this might be redundant. That's how I got unfolded into the queer and unfolded into the outsider, unfolded into the indigenous, because the indigenous is often treated as a foreigner in his or her own land. And also the núcleo histórico. I thought, it was interesting to put together a nucleus historical, again, going back to the Biennale São Paulo that I worked in under Paulo Heckenhoff in 98.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And it's a great title in the sense that you can also zoom in, of course, like Venice being this place that's entirely full of foreigners half of the year. I think the population like triples in summer or something. But, you brought up Roberto Ceccuto, and something that he said that I thought was a really interesting point in the introduction of your concept earlier this year. He said, no curator in picking the theme of their exhibition seeks to directly engage in a hot topic of discussion. Your exhibition, however, you couldn't have imagined it at the time, but is going to be read against a massive displacement of Gazans. There's a war in Ukraine still ongoing. There's a lot of conflicts unfolding across the globe. And this term, of course, can be read as an umbrella, a rallying call for all of these. And so, I wondered, how are you working through that? And how do you navigate the kind of projections that will be brought into this show? And, potentially also political statements and actions that might take place?
I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I expect that there will be many statements and many positions, and I think they are legitimate, right? I think people need to express themselves, and definitely the title for the exhibition was, of course, chosen before this terrible, terrible war started. It is really a tragedy. When the war started, the exhibition was pretty much finished, and the artists all invited. And
You mean the war in Gaza?
Yeah, the war in Gaza. But there will be a number of references. There's not like a work directly addressing this, but there will be a small number of references. It's difficult to predict. I mean, it's impossible to predict, right? We didn't know we would be in this situation 6 months ago. And I don't know what kind of situation will be, at the opening, right? I think these are dialogues and debates and conflicts that happen in the world, and the exhibition will run parallel to that. And, if these manifestations occur, we'll just have to digest it and understand it, and if needed, address it somehow, right? There's not much I can say because, I can't really predict.
Of course. I was thinking that, you created a very successful program that was also very provocative within the context of Bolsonaro's Brazil as well. So I imagine that you acquired some learnings through that. Is there anything that you're carrying forward from that experience towards the biennial at all?
To expect polemics, to expect issues like that. You're not going to navigate this without anything happening. And you just have to accept that there will be other things going on. You can't control everything. We've had a number of polemics with our exhibitions and our themes and our topics, histories of sexuality. There was some polemics around it. Brazilian histories also, there was some polemics around it. Things like this, it's almost like unavoidable. If you're doing a large-scale exhibition with themes that have a political dimension like this one, it's unavoidable, right? You're not going to navigate this without any issues coming up. They will come up. And I think it's part of the discussion, right? It's somehow also what contemporary arts and exhibitions can do. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it's very problematic. But if you're part of the dialogue, if you're engaging with contemporary themes, this will happen, right? If I do an exhibition around color or, movement, or I don't know, perhaps it would be easier, but we're engaging with these things. So I think this is almost unavoidable. I think it's safe to say that this is the most politically loaded title for a biennale in Venice, right? So I think many of them do have political kind of dimensions, but perhaps this one seems like the one that this is more prevalent, let's say. It will happen, and let's see how we're going to come out of this, and hopefully we'll provoke some interesting thoughts and reflections. And that's also the role of exhibitions.
Certainly.
Right?
Yeah. A place for discourse. That's sort of the whole point.
And debate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And many different kinds of viewpoints. And I think that that's something that the foreigner obviously represents, right? As many voices. I want to ask you about the scale. This is such a large exhibition, and I can imagine that as a curator, you must imagine how someone is going to move through it. Are there any hopes that you have for viewers of how to navigate a show of this size? I know sometimes that people talk about, like, how am I supposed to see everything at a biennial? I mean, I even wonder this myself half the time. I can't watch all the videos. What would you advise people who are about to walk into the show?
Begin with the central pavilion in the Giardini, and then move to the outdoor areas, and then go to the Corderia in the Arsenale, and then go through it one day, and the second day, go through it all over again. That's what I used to do. I mean, I used to do that. In fact, I would always start through the Corderia, but I realized that most people start through the central pavilion. There's not like one, you can start through the Arsenale or through the central pavilion. But I realize most people start through the central pavilion. But what I would always do, I would always come to Venice, and I was interested in the position, in the proposal, in the exhibition that was being put together by the artistic director, by the curator. So I would always focus in the international exhibition. Of course, the pavilions are wonderful as well, collateral events, but I was always trying to understand what the international exhibition was proposing. The vernissage is also very cacophonic as well. Not polyphonic, but cacophonic, because you have like so many people and so many wonderful colleagues that you're meeting and talking and having conversations. So that's part of the experience as well. So I would always try to see it twice. For me, that was the priority. But I realized some people go to the pavilions beforehand, because there will be pavilions, that there will be queues in some of the pavilions. And then, of course, there's everything that's happening in the city, right? That's everything you want to visit in Venice. Not only the collateral events, but all the other wonderful events that happen in the institutions, right? The short guide helps a lot, I think. I also suggest getting the short guide because it guides you through the exhibition. We've provided short texts, of course, as we always do, for all the artists in the exhibition. And there are also section texts. So I hope this will be quite didactic and interesting for people to visit. There was a strategy regarding the videos also. Looking at such an enormous exhibition and coming in and saying like a 60-minute video, that was very much a concern of ours. And I really tried to select, although we do have like one section devoted to film and video, the Disobedience Archive, that has videos of different lengths there. But within the video projection rooms, we really were trying to think that these videos should be of a certain, reasonable length. It's very different when you go to an exhibition and there's one single video on display, and it could be an hour video, and you sit there and you have a lot of time. But in an exhibition such as this one, this is definitely something that we thought about quite carefully. We also thought about a certain rhythm regarding the exhibition, particularly in the Corderie of the Arsenale and the Artiglieri. Arsenale is the whole area, but the first long stretch is called Corderie. And then as you make a left towards the end, it's the Artiglieri. I also thought very carefully about the position of certain large-scale works that would provide sort of a rhythm to the exhibition. So you have this formal play of scale, of like small-scale work, mid-scale work, paintings and sculptures, and large-scale works, also very large-scale works that will help you navigate throughout the Arsenale, as it were. So this will hopefully also help people to walk through and experience the exhibition.
Fantastic. And also not to be missed is the performances that are going to occur at the opening and closing, as well as some outdoor projects too.
Yeah. So we have the international exhibition. That's what I'm saying. Main venues always is the Corderie and the Artiglieri of the Arsenale and the Central Pavilion. But we have some outdoor works, both in the Arsenale as well as in the Giardini. We have Sol Calero, for example. She's doing a large-scale work, Venezuelan artist living in Berlin. Ivan Argotti, who's a Colombian artist living in Paris, is doing a large-scale work also in the Giardini. That area, the two green areas that we have next to the Brazilian pavilion. And one area is with a work by Ivan Argotti. Another area is a work by queer artist Lyndon Johnson from the US, also living in Berlin or back and forth between the US and Berlin.
That's true.
And then we also have some large-scale works in the Arsenale. Lauren Halsey, an artist from LA. We have a very large-scale new work by her. Most of these works in the outdoor areas are new works. Leila Barbiri, Ugandan artist living in New York as well. Beatriz Cortez, an artist from El Salvador living in the US. Ana Maria Maiolino is one of our Golden Lions. She is also working on new installation. And Taylor Nkomo, an artist from Zimbabwe, also presenting some sculptures there in the Arsenale. And then we have a performance program as well that happens at the opening of the exhibition. We have 8 performances. I don't think I'll remember all of them, but I can certainly try.
That's okay. Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been totally illuminated, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the show, even more so now than I was before. I feel that you must have somewhere to run to right now as you're putting last touches on the show, so I'll let you go.
Yes.
But thank you so much, Adriano, for your time today.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Carolyn Goldstein. Thanks for listening as always, and see you next week.